Welcome to the Lenguillat podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Rich Cohen. Rich is a full-time author. By my latest count, he has written 13 books. He will confirm that in a minute. He is co-creator of the HBO series Vinyl, contributing editor at Vanity Fair and Rolling Stone. He has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine. And today we'll speak about his latest book, The Adventures of Herbie Cohen, World's Greatest Negotiator. Rich, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
So, Rich, just to mention this for the audience, this is the second time that we have a conversation. The first time was about 18 months ago when we spoke about your book, Pee-wee and the adventures of a father who had to follow his kid around from hockey tournament to hockey tournament. And now I get to hear about your father. But before we get there, I wonder if you could just tell us a brief introduction about your life for those who didn't hear that previous episode. Who are you? Why have you devoted your life to writing, etc., etc.?
I was just a kid who told a lot of stories. My father told a lot of stories. And I've just been interested in meeting people, talking to them, interviewing them, and writing up stories that interest me. Everything I've written about is something I was probably interested in at age 15. So it's a case of arrested development. And you mentioned Pee-wee's. Pee-wee's begins with my father. He was like the youth hockey parent I learned from, and he gave me one piece of advice about being a parent, which is also, his key to negotiating, which is the key to success is to care, but not that much. So my father, his philosophy runs through all this stuff that I do.
And how long or how is it that you got your career started as a writer? You started doing something else and then you stumble your way into writing, or is that something that you have always done?
I got a job out of college. I thought it was going to be just a summer job until I figured out what to do, maybe until I went back to school as a messenger at the New Yorker magazine, delivering packages around New York. And I started reading that magazine and sort of fell in love with it. And then I started trying to write. And I wrote story after story after story, which was a great way to get to know New York because I was new to New York. And I traveled around meeting people, writing stories about them. And after about a year and a half of getting stories rejected, they started getting accepted. And I've been on that road ever since.
And that's your full-time career, right? You don't do something else on the side, don't teach, don't
Not
do
only
photography?
don't I do anything else, I can't do anything else. So I'm in trouble. If this fails, I'm in big trouble because there's nothing else I can do.
Well, the other thing that you do is that you drive your kid around from hockey tournament to hockey tournament.
Yeah, they don't pay you for that. They take your money for that. That's the problem.
That's right. Okay, well, then can you tell us, give us this into a brief introduction towards this book, The Adventures of Herbie Cohen. Who was Herbie Cohen?
Well, my father's alive. He's 89 years old. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. He's had a very long, interesting, strange life. When I was 12 years old, he wrote a book, wrote it longhand in our basement called You Can Negotiate Anything, which was rejected by like 20 publishers before someone finally accepted it. He never really gave up. He kept pressing. And then ultimately, by his own going around the country and spreading it like gospel, it became a big bestseller and sold over 2 million copies, and it's still selling. It's sort of the first kind of one of the first how-to modern business books. And it's sort of his philosophy of life trained towards business. And I remember when I was a kid, he was going around promoting the books. And what he would say was his philosophy was power is based on perception. If you think you got it, even if you don't got it. And if you don't think you got it, even if you got it, you don't got it. And his message was sort of to show people that they had power, even if they thought they didn't. And it was to empower the seemingly weaker parties and to teach this kind of thing he called win-win negotiation. I think he was the first person to say that. But ultimately, all the things he taught, because he was a teacher and he taught at the FBI and at all these businesses, and he worked in negotiations, it was all based around stories he'd been telling since he was a kid, which he'd use as examples for how to get along with people. So sort of like problem, story, moral, like Aesop's fables. So I grew up learning how to tell stories from him and curious about his own life. And his own life was a lot more interesting than my life. I thought I grew up in the suburbs in a very kind of nice, bland, safe place. And he grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn in the 50s and 60s when a lot was going on. And I sort of had this ideal about his childhood as being something kind of magical that I envied. And I tried to write about it in this book.
And why, to get stuck on the subject of negotiation? I mean, he's well-read, a person with a lot of knowledge. I mean, he could have focused his life to any other topic. Why is that topic of negotiation the one that he devoted most of his life?
Well, I think he just did it very naturally. As a kid, his friends would say he got them into trouble, just the challenge to see if he could get them out. And he sort of likes being involved with people, knowing their problems, trying to help them. He feels like he's doing good, and he would like solving problems. And just his natural knowledge about dealing with people, he saw as negotiation. One of the things he saw was, or he believes, is that there's no difference between negotiating and how you're negotiating. When he started, people were afraid of negotiating. It was like a scary word. It wasn't a common word. People saw it as kind of haggling. And the way he looked at it was, you're negotiating all the time, even if you don't know it, even if that's not what you call it. And he saw that people using their authority to sort of intimidate and oppress other people, that authority was questionable. And one of the things he always talked about that I thought was so interesting was negotiating at like a department store, because people don't think you can negotiate at a department store. And he uses it as an example, which is that everything is negotiable. And he had this formula where he'd say, you know, you get this big sign in the department store in a refrigerator, and you feel like it was placed there by God. That's what he'd said in these big block letters. But he'd sort of say, it actually is a product itself of a negotiation. A bunch of people sitting around a room arbitrarily set this price, and anything that is the product of a negotiation is negotiable. And that's pretty much everything. And to tell these lessons, he would go all the way back and tell stories about the Bible and tell about negotiations that are recorded all over the Bible. And it affected the way I dealt with people, the way I told stories, and the way I read, because he had this very interesting way of looking at stories and seeing what was really going on. And I just thought that he was saying something about more than negotiating. So it's called negotiation, but it was really about life.
Well, you are a father, and one of the things that fathers tell me is that they are always constantly negotiating with the world's greatest negotiator, which are their own kids.
Yeah.
So as you know, as much as your kid makes you pay for his hockey practices, you were at one time your father's son, and you were constantly negotiating against him. I wonder what it felt like to be negotiating, going out for a party, or borrowing his car, or asking for money.
Well, that's one of his points, is that kids are natural negotiators. And in fact, his book started with a story about me. Age 9, I hated to go out to restaurants. And they'd take me to a fancy restaurant, and I stood up on the table and screamed, "This is a crummy restaurant." And they pulled me out of the restaurant. And he said, they never took me to a restaurant again for 10 years. I got what I wanted. And he said, I used, knowledge, which was that they didn't want to be embarrassed in a restaurant, and information about their needs to get what I wanted. So, but another thing he says is, you should never negotiate for yourself, because his rule is you got to care, but not that much. And when you negotiate for yourself, the problem is you care too much. And especially with your kids, you care way too much. So you can take the greatest negotiator in the world and put him in a negotiation with his own kids, and they'll get destroyed. And I think that's what happened with my father, which is I was negotiating with him all the time. And ultimately, I would get what I wanted because he wasn't good at negotiating with his own kids, and nobody ever has been.
Wow. I thought it was very funny when you talk about, quote unquote, losing your virginity in the negotiation field. Can you tell us about how is it that you lost your virginity negotiating for something?
Well, I needed to buy a car, my first car. And my father's very meticulous about, what you got to first information, you got to gather information. So we had to determine what the best car for me was. And it was like a list of like 50 cars with all these categories. And after all that, he came up with the best car for me was a used Toyota Corolla with more than 50,000 miles on it. So not a very sexy car, by the way, but the car that I could afford that he thought was safe and meet all these categories. So he finally found the car after looking and looking and looking, because one of his things is be ready to walk away, and the car was perfect. And then he said, we shouldn't get it. And I said, why? And he said, did you look at this car? And on the hood of the car, on the driver's side door of the car, it said Bobby. And I guess that was the previous driver's name. And on the other door, it said Barry. And on the front, it said Chuck. And he said, did you see all that writing? I said, yes, so what? We'll have it painted over. He said, you're missing the point. A schmuck owned this car. And I always thought of that because that's like, he has this other point, which is there's a difference between the what and the how, So like we would always eat at this terrible restaurant in our town all the time. And finally I said, why are we eating at the same bad restaurant no one likes? He said, because they give us the booth. And that's like the how, like it was pleasant to be in there, even though the food was bad. And this is the thing where the car couldn't be trusted because as far as he was concerned, a highly suspect person had been driving around before us.
Wow. Okay. Well, and your father, of course, he negotiated with you. He negotiated to restaurants he would eat, but your father was a high, did some high-level negotiation. Can you tell us about some of those high-level negotiations?
Well, when the Iran hostage crisis happened, which was right when he was sort of probably in his early 40s, and, American students were taken hostage in Iran. The Shah of Iran was just out of power and the Ayatollah was new to power. He was brought in by the President Jimmy Carter administration to be part of the negotiations, like how should we deal with this situation? And one of the things he did was he predicted to within 3 minutes, I think, when the hostages would be released. And he did it publicly and he was right. And that kind of made him famous in a way for a while. And then he worked for Ronald Reagan and he worked for Bill Clinton. He was, not a political person. He was an expert on negotiating and he did negotiations and he trained other people how to negotiate in these tense situations, all stuff from when he was a kid in Brooklyn. And he worked for George Bush. And then I think the thing that he had a lot of fun doing, which doesn't sound crazy, but his whole thing, he's got to have fun because life is a game, is he was on the START talks, which are the strategic arms Russian, strategic tactical arms, whatever. It's about nuclear weapons. And he negotiated on the US team with the Russians. And one of the things he did that was really interesting, he talked about different negotiating styles. And one style that he really learned about in that process was what he called the Soviet style, which you see now, actually, in the world. So, and it's a zero sum, which he's like philosophically opposed to, which is it's not good enough for me to win to be successful. You have to lose.
Right.
And as far as he's concerned, like whenever you make a deal like that, the deal will fall apart. So ultimately, it might make you feel good in some sick way, but it's not in your interest because you're not going to be successful. The other side's got to think that they win, both do better, and then both people will have an interest in making whatever you've agreed on succeed. So you actually have to make your opponent's life better to make your life better. And that's just a philosophical view of how the world should be, which is we kind of have to all rise together or we're all going to fall together.
Right. Okay. Well, you grew up close to your father or in his father's life, and you were constantly learning from him. But I wonder, doing the research for this book, putting it together, first of all, did you learn anything new about your father? And secondly, did you learn anything new about negotiation?
Well, I read his book again, because I read it when I was a kid and I heard him talk. And, I learned a lot from my father, but as a kid, you have a tendency to, after a while, stop listening to your father. And not because, it's your father or whatever, your parent. So I really what amazed me going back reading and talking to him was how optimistic and how hopeful his negotiating philosophy is, which is, it really is about everybody winning. It's just an interesting, good way to look at the world. I find it kind of profound and very hopeful. what I learned when I looking at his life and talking and getting all these stories told again and again is that I believe, like, you said, why did he become a negotiator? That's his personality from when he was a kid. It's like character is destiny. And it's like that. So when I look at his life, when I look what he was doing when he was 15 years old and what he's doing when he's 85 years old, I see the same person doing the same things. So stepping back and writing about him, I saw that there's this thing unifying his whole life, which is his character and his personality. And that's kind of reassuring, because sometimes you think as a person that if in a different situation, you do something different, everything in your life seems to be luck or, a series of events you can't control. But basically, people stay, I think, the same and presented with the same challenges. You do something similar again and again. And that's kind of what I saw in his life, which was one big story.
You were fortunate enough to have him close to be your teacher. Other corporations and government institutions were able to afford his services, but for the rest of us who would like to become better negotiator and don't have a mentor such as your father, what is it that we could do in order to test ourselves, see how far we can go, continue learning and growing, or develop those skills as a negotiator?
Well, I tried to take all the stuff I learned from him and put it in a very simple way in my book. And I know that what you said is true about, what he did, but he then wrote his book, which is still around. So you didn't have to, it was available to everyone. He wanted what he sort of figured out in his life to be available to everyone. And I've tried to distill it even more in my book. So I think that my book is, his story, the story of his life and the story of my relationship with him and all that. But it's also, I tried to get the things that he teaches that were most important to me in this book. So if you read this book, you come away seeing things a little differently and learning how to negotiate a little better.
My girlfriend, she thinks it is unfair that some people get a better deal in life just because they have the courage to ask for it, while there are people who don't have the courage to ask. For example, if I go to a store and ask for a discount and I get it, she thinks it's unfair that, like life is unfair. You had the nerve to ask for a discount when prices are set and you get it. But there are people like me who would never think of asking for a discount, like, what can we do? And I ask you the same question for people like her who think it's unfair or unethical or improper to ask for a discount or for better conditions of this or that or the other thing. How can we change their mindset and let them know that it's okay to ask for a better deal?
Well, what he would say is, like, the key to being successful in that kind of thing is, can you live with uncertainty? Can you live with ambiguity? That's the key. So if you're going to go and you're going to ask for a discount, you don't know what's going to happen. You think you might be embarrassed, or the person might yell at you, or might laugh at you, or kick you out of the store. So the easiest thing to do, the most certain thing, is just pay the price, whatever they're asking. So basically, you're getting something for paying the full price. You get to live with certainty. You don't have to have this uncomfortable exchange. So by not asking, she's getting what she wants, which is, she doesn't want to deal with the, embarrassment or feeling bad or whatever it is. But if you can live with the ambiguity and look at it as ambiguity, then you can ask. And if everybody's available to ask and try to get things for a better price, including your girlfriend, and tell her that the problem is she needs to look at it as a game and look at it as something fun to do. And then she's sort of getting something more for her money, which is an experience that's kind of entertaining and fun. So I think that for her, and it's good for, they want to, everybody wins in a negotiation, like, because you feel good, you got a better price, and the store feels good that they made a sale, and they're not going to sell it to you for something that makes them feel bad, So ultimately, everybody comes out ahead, and you just have to ask. So one thing my father always said is, don't look at yourself as somebody who's buying a product. Look at yourself as somebody who's selling your money. Turn it around. Look at her, that she's the one who's got the thing people want. She's selling her money, and then it's seen a different way.
do you think most Americans are turned off by negotiation? For example, one of the worst experience for many people is going to buy a car because they know that if you are a good negotiator, you can get a better deal for your car, whether it's a new car or a used car. And then they have this uncertainty and stress because they feel that someone is going to get a better piece of it. So I feel like many Americans, they just hate the idea of having to negotiate, and they rather, people like a set price, no
Right. Well,
negotiation.
that's what I'm talking about. They pay for that, which is
Right.
not having to think about it. But it is a cultural thing, and you do negotiate all the time, just in different with your kids, or people have no problem negotiating when you buy a house, you know. And one of the things one of the things I learned from my father is like the negotiation is important, especially like in buying a house, in making both sides feel good at the end and the deal stick. And I'll give you an example, which is a couple years ago, I sold my apartment. I had nowhere to live. We had a baby. We needed to buy a house very quick. The market was crazy. And I finally said, we like this house. Let's just give them the asking price. And then we don't have to go back and forth and blah, 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 blah. And my father said, that's a mistake. Okay, you won't get the house if you do that, which sounded crazy. I'm giving them the asking price. I gave them the asking price, and then they asked for more money than their own asking price. And then I got so mad I didn't buy that house. And his point was that when you give somebody the asking price, they don't think, oh, great, I got what I wanted. They think, oh, no, I didn't ask for enough. I could have gotten more. And then they're looking for reasons to get out of the deal so they can get more. So you have to act like it's hard, like you're giving as much as you can. You're coming up, and there's this whole dance, which people see as haggling or cheap or whatever it is. But it's really about making both sides at the end of the day feel satisfied that they got the most that they can get. And they both walk away feeling like, I got a good deal. And then the deal sticks and you get the house. So you do that all the time with, houses, and with cars, it's very ritualistic and it's very confusing because of the internet. There's the internet prices and all this stuff. And right now it's a very weird time because there's not enough cars. But basically, it's just part of the thing that makes society work and always has for thousands of years. And you got it. You're doing it even if you don't know you're doing it.
Well, I'll tell you something, Rich. I think that if someone gets your book and your father's book, they will get tenfold the price that they paid for. And that would be a very good deal. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
The book is called The Adventures of Herbie Cohen, World's Greatest Negotiator. He was actually called that by People magazine when I was a kid. That's where it comes from.
Wasn't it Playboy?
I'm sorry. Of course, Playboy, because that gave me an excuse to legitimately have a Playboy because I had the article about my father. It was in Playboy magazine, and it was a big deal because Playboy magazine was a huge magazine then. And you can get it, in any local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anything. It's around, and I think if you read it, you'll find that you will live a better life as a result.
And do people have to haggle for the price of the book? They pay the retail price.
I'm sure they can. If they walk into a store, they can negotiate. I have a whole thing in the book where he talks about the different ways you can negotiate for things like books that you wouldn't think are negotiable, but they are. But for that, you have to go into the store and be a little creative about it.
Rich, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.